titled, thank you, titled Mayflower 400 Legend. I nearly said legend then, Legend and Legacy. However, I do know that Joe has taken a slightly different tack with some aspects of tonight's talk. We're going to be looking at some aspects of the ethical questions surrounding this particularly important museum exhibition. So, Joe Loosemore is broadcaster, curator, actor, created radio dramas, documentaries, and live programs for the BBC, and is also now curator of, as I say, this important exhibition, still on, ladies and gentlemen, still on, Mayflower 400 Legend and the Legacy. It's the commemorative exhibition for Plymouth's brand new, spanking, postmodernly designed The Box Centre. And Joe is also the co-curator of the important national touring exhibition built around the Mayflower story, Wampum, Stories from the Shells of Native America. So without further ado, Joe, over to you, and good luck.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone, from sunny Plymouth, would you believe? On something of an auspicious occasion, the 16th of September is, in fact, to the day, would you believe, the 401st anniversary of the departure of the Mayflower to America. Now, you may well ask what the Blue Blazers happened to the 400th anniversary, and that, of course, is part of the wider story that I'll share with you tonight. But today is something of an appropriate day, at least, to start sharing some aspects of this story. It probably begins, for me at least, 4 years ago when I was asked to curate this exhibition, what became this exhibition for the box about the Mayflower. I was given some pretty key starting points. The first was to co-curate the exhibition with the Wampanoag people. The Wampanoag people, who are effectively the descendants today of the Native American tribal people who met the passengers of the Mayflower 400 years ago. So that was my direction number one, and more about that to come, most certainly. My direction number two was, oh, by the way, Joe, there's no stuff, so you'll just have to find it and borrow it and see what you can do in that regard. So I set out to find the material culture, if you like, and also the story that I would tell. My word, little did I know, I have to say, not being a 17th century specialist in any way, shape, or form, little did I know that I would find a local, national, and international story that was quite as compelling, defining, surprising, and I think I would possibly add terrifying into that, really. Little did I know. So, what I'm going to do tonight is to take you on, I suppose, my journey, if you like. I should warn you that the preparations take forever. The ship is not quite what it was. There are most certainly storms at sea, and you will need seasickness tablets at some moments. This is Mayflower 400. Something, if you like, of an ethical voyage. Or not, depending on your point of view. So, for those of you who know anything about the Mayflower, and indeed for those of you who don't, this is what many people view as quote unquote difficult history. It's about colonization, it's about the English colonization of Native America, and it's really about a clash of cultures and a legacy which lives on today. So effectively, whichever way you look at this, you're looking at political history, you're looking at family history, And essentially, you are looking at living history too. So it does most definitely present some, what I like to call, ethical challenges. Looking at those from a museological perspective takes us, of course, to the code of ethics and essentially to that line in bold. Here we are, a museum in Plymouth, like our other museum colleagues, having to make sound ethical judgments in all areas of our work in order to maintain the trust of our audiences. It's tricky, isn't it? Because how do we know what those sound ethical judgments actually are? How do we ensure that we make them consistently? Who's actually qualified to make them? And how do our internal structures, let alone our external partnerships, if you like, ensure that we make sound ethical judgments? What I'm going to do is take you through some of those that we faced, and ultimately you can be the judges as to whether we did indeed make sound ethical judgments or not. Effectively, this is the story of a show. It's the story of a show in 2020, ostensibly, and a ship in 1620. It's about then and it's about now. So let me try and blend both together, if you like, in hopefully a lot less than 400 years. So my E of ethical is really economics and expectations. Now, in 1620, as you will know, I'm sure, this was about the opportunity of colonization. It was an age of early joint stock companies, of investment, about the search for new opportunities, trading opportunities across the Atlantic. And the passengers of the Mayflower knew that. I mean, ultimately, they were part of that economical challenge and opportunity, if you like. Some of them sold their homes, they sold their businesses. Some of them, it's documented, left their families in poverty. Effectively, they all made a financial investment and a financial commitment to this journey. That's why you see the coin there. That's a James I Unite coin. It was actually found in Devon as part of a gold hoard, and that became part of the exhibit because I wanted to portray this as a story about money. Traditionally, we see it as a story of religion, but I think it's most definitely one about money. The second piece there is the second Pierce patent, which we actually brought back to Plymouth for the first time in 400 years. That document gave the passengers of the Mayflower English permission to settle in America, and it also gave them English rights over Native American resources. Ethical? In 2020, 400 years on, we were looking at the reopening of a museum, a new museum, gallery and archive, £46 million worth, I should add. And it was about the city investing in Mayflower as a story, as a concept, as a campaign, and as an anniversary. There was the expectation that Plymouth would welcome 500,000 tourists to the city, many of them American. So for the city, this was about economic regeneration. And so it meant that there were economic incentives and inspiration for this exhibition, for this show. So I guess the ethical issue we faced here is, does money matter? How much does money matter? Is it actually ethical to tell a colonial story with a view to contemporary economic regeneration. That, if you like, was ethical question number one. It wasn't the only one, though, was it? Ethical truths. Ultimately, this story and the wider story of English colonies in America is essentially about the decimation of Native America. In this case, particularly the Wampanoag people, who had lived on their ancestral lands for 12,000 years. In 67, 70, 80, 90 villages, primarily along the eastern seaboard. They're known as the people of the first light, the people of the dawn. Of course, because numbers are difficult during this period, we don't know precise numbers, but we do know that today there are 5,000 Wampanoag people living on those same lands. So this story is about the impact of colonization. That's exposed in demographics. That's also clear in ongoing land rights battles today. And for the Wampanoag people, as they share it with us, this is about living history. So that is very much about one very profound ethical aspect of this story. At the other extreme, epitomized in one of my favorite pictures, the Pilgrim Instant Disguise Kit, which I should reveal to you is a real thing. I know, very scary in a different kind of way. You have that quote unquote truth, the quote unquote pilgrim past, the hats, the buckles, and 400 years again of quote unquote heroic storytelling. In between, you have the legacy of Victorian exceptionalism and its fictional representation of the passengers, their departure, and their arrival. And I should say, in that context, very rarely their arrival and never their impact on the Wampanoag people. The ethical issue here, I think, is whether you can bring these stories together, whether you should bring these stories together, and if so, how. And I guess the clue is in the T's, trust and time, and effectively what we gave it 3 years of research and partnership development. But of course, there are more ethical questions in the histories themselves. Of course, we went back to the original historic source material, particularly to those astonishing images left to us from John White, probably a Cornishman, original material in the British Museum today. He recorded Roanoke, England's lost colony in America, dating back to the 1580s. We also went back to some of the texts about Jamestown, England's first colony in America in 1607. And of course, we went back to Mort's Relation, the first documented history of the Plymouth colony, published in London in 1622. But what's notable about all of these texts and these images, they're all English. They're all told from an English perspective. And of course, ours is a scribal culture, isn't it? Written in text, and ultimately this did, and you could argue still does, dominate oral cultures such as that of the Wampanoag Native Americans. I mean, ultimately, pen and paper suits posterity. So there's a bias in the history and in the existing sources. The ethical issue for us there then is, can you actually rebalance in the sources? Can you include the oral in any way? And can that work in in an exhibition which tends to prioritize the written, albeit sometimes in visual forms. Where are the ethical lines there? You can see why I was wondering whether this might end up more of as a therapy session. I'll be interested in your thoughts and support, certainly. The eye of ethical for our purposes here, I've called identities, insights, and interests because, my gosh, are there multiple ones in this story? But as you can see from the images here, these are our Wampanoag partners. Paula on the left, who effectively is a Wampanoag tribal scholar and educator, and an incredible driver of Wampanoag history, particularly around what has been the 400th anniversary of the sailing and the arrival of the Mayflower. On the other side of your screen, you've got Ramona Peters. She's an artist, a ceramicist, who we commissioned. She effectively is the first ever Wampanoag artist to be commissioned by Plymouth to make a piece for Plymouth. It's taken 400 years. We decided that we had to co-curate this show because we wanted to tell a shared history. We had to tell a shared history. Now that is radically different from all commemorations that have gone before, actually on both sides of the Atlantic. We approached an organization which is called, I think it's got the most astonishing name, it's called the Wampanoag Advisory Committee to Plymouth 400. So they're based in the States. They were established to advise Plymouth 400 in the US as opposed to Plymouth 400 in the UK. However, they ended up most definitely doing both. We asked them to help us, to work with us, but more importantly, perhaps, to teach us, to advise us, to explain to us, so that we could tell a shared history here. Now, the ethical issues around this are also quite strong as well. Ultimately, the idea for the Legend and Legacy exhibition came from us. It came from us. So within that, is there an implicit imbalance, a difference in power, if you like? The other question is, why should they help us? And actually, museological colleagues of mine at the time, particularly those in the States, said, "What? You're going to ask them to help you? Why should they help you? Why would they? They don't owe you. We're not sure they will help you." And that in itself was a very powerful statement. They have helped us, and I'm speaking now from the perspective of 4 years on and a 4-year partnership. But nonetheless, I think there are some ethical issues within that. They have worked with us. I say they, certain individuals from the Wampanoag Nation have helped us. They've helped us on behalf of a committee of Wampanoag people who've been supporting the commemoration in different ways. But do they fully represent their entire community? Or are they gatekeepers of it? And again, I think there are ethical issues there. I have to say, though, they have been extraordinary, and we were absolutely privileged throughout to be able to work with them. But some people might say, wait a minute, have you worked with them to the exclusion of other interests on this side of the Atlantic, be that maritime historians, be that the Dutch, the religious communities, the families of descendants? And again, I would suggest to you again that there are some ethical questions there. Then we go on to collections. clearly we're a museum making an exhibition, and therefore we're interested not just in the story we're telling, but the images we tell it through, and of course the objects, the material culture. Now, as I admitted at the beginning, we had very little in terms of our collection here in Plymouth. That's, I suppose, not quite fair in the sense that we have some commemorative material, 20th century material, mostly from 1920 and the 300th anniversary. We also have material dating back to the 1950s, which saw the making of a replica Mayflower in our area, and also 1970, which marked the 300th anniversary of the sailing. Ostensibly, though, this had to be a loan show, so we had to borrow material from museums, libraries, and archives across the UK, the United States, the Wampanoag Nation, and Holland. In the end, we brought 300 items together, 32 lenders, and 3 rotations of objects as well because of the duration of the show. Now, there are many ethical issues here. The first, if you take a look at the Bible, so the bottom picture in the middle, I was wildly excited about this Bible. This Bible is actually held by Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. It belonged to John Alden, who was one of the passengers. He was the cooper, joined the ship in Southampton. This Bible was in his family for effectively most of this time before it found its way to Dartmouth College. So I spoke with the librarian there who said, yeah, sure, you can borrow it. And I thought, my gosh, how amazing. This is probably the only object I will find and be able to borrow that belonged to a Mayflower passenger. On the outside, it notes that this Bible was taken to America on the Mayflower in 1620. Astonishing. But for the fact that the Bible itself was printed in 1633. And while the provenance of this is sound in museological terms, what it throws up here is, in a way, I suppose, the complications around Mayflower material culture. You know, so many objects are purported to have travelled on the Mayflower. My gosh, if all of those objects had, trust me, the Mayflower would never have left Southampton. You know, the Mayflower material culture is about, in a way, making a memory as well. And it's about objects being connected to this story out of will in many ways, but sometimes the story they tell is perhaps not the story that you want them to tell. And that's why we went with this one, because in a way it throws up some of the issues. And you could argue the ethical questions. Now, there are contextual issues here as well. You know, how could I possibly portray the children who travelled on board? They made up about 30, 32, 33, depending on the age groups you take, of the 102 passengers. You know, how can I portray them? You know, very little exists of them. So was it ethically acceptable for me to use toys from a period hoard from Market Harborough in Leicestershire in order to convey the experiences of the children of the Mayflower? Again, I'm happy to take your thoughts on that. But I think perhaps the biggest ethical question here is about Wampanoag objects. Now, here we had a museological dilemma, if you like, in the sense that the Wampanoag people themselves have spent a lot of time reclaiming, rediscovering their culture, and so they have a very active use of replicas from an English and and indeed a British museum perspective, we always favour the original object. So you had a kind of cultural difference there, if you like. But more fundamentally, perhaps, is the fact that colonisation has effectively not just decimated the people, it decimated their objects, their material culture as well. So there are fewer Wampanoag items in museum collections than there are English and or Anglo-American collections. So again, you have a difference there. All I would say is that our partnership with the Wampanoag enabled us to access collections from the National Museum of the American Indian. We wouldn't have been able to do that had we not been working with them and committed to sharing their story as well. But you can see, again, some of the ethical challenges around objects themselves. Clearly, you can see the armour there. For me, this was about relaying the, how can I even put it? I suppose the fact that English arrivals, European arrivals, took arms and armour into America. And again, that's not part of the story that is told. Ethically, I think that is important and was something that absolutely needed to be told. The A of our ethical relates to, gosh, all of these things. Audiences, agendas, aims. Oh my gosh, were there lots of these? Ultimately, doing this exhibition in Plymouth, a new, albeit revamped institution in Plymouth, meant that this exhibition had to have a fair bit of Plymouth in it, I should say, because it marked the reopening of a museum which had been closed for 4 years. So I needed to appeal to locals as well as to establish Plymouth as a national and international destination. That was part of the city's agenda for this show. So effectively, it meant the juggling of not just museological agendas, but also political and economic ones as well. It meant that there were expectations of all kinds of levels. That meant doing an awful lot of formative evaluation. And actually, we spoke to about 1,500 local people of different interest levels, of different ages, of different abilities in the creation of the show. But even then, I think you have the ethical question of, are you actually talking to the right people? Are you talking to enough people? Are you asking them the right questions? And how is it ethically if you actually not just challenge their expectations, but in fact you dash their expectations by telling a story that they don't expect and haven't heard, with potentially very different content and a very different context, and I would say a radically different starting point. So, legacies. Traditionally, it seemed to me that this story, as it has been pretty consistently told for 400 years or so, it traditionally finishes in 1621 with what has come to be known as Thanksgiving, quote unquote. Now, clearly, the story of the Mayflower didn't finish there, because there's a living legacy today. And there's quite a story to be told in between as well. A story today which resonates with possibly 30 million Mayflower descendants, 30 million people who claim to have Mayflower ancestry. from the 50 surviving original colonists. But the legacy is also felt by those 5,000 Wampanoag people who live in what is now Massachusetts today. So our ethical questions were, how do we reflect the legacy of this story? What does that look like now? What collections or materials do we use to tell it? And I became particularly fascinated by the piece that you see on the left. Some of you may know it. This is it's known as the Eliot Bible, sometimes known as the Algonquin Bible. First Bible to be printed in America in 1661. That was the first edition. What's notable about it is not just that it was the first Bible to be printed in America, but the text that it was printed in. Effectively, it was written in an Algonquin language, so the ancestral language of the Wampanoag people, and indeed the Massachusetts people, but it is an ancestral language that they spoke, but at the time couldn't read. And clearly this was a text which had been created and printed as a way of converting Native Americans to Christianity. So this was a tool of colonization in many ways. So this is quite a difficult text in a way to exhibit, you could argue. But the reason it ended up in the legacy section is that today this text is being used by the Wampanoag people to enable them to reclaim the spoken language which they lost as a result of colonization. If you think about that, there are some quite profound complexities in it. So actually, when Paula Peters came to this country to do some work with us, we went to King's College London to see this text, which she had never seen for real, but which she had heard about because obviously her community had been using the text to learn the language from it. You know, a language that had not been spoken by her people for 6 generations. Yeah, quite. In the middle, you've got some Wampanoag humour. As a picture, effectively, I'm sorry we can't see it all there, but effectively you have 2 stereotypical Native Americans carrying a turkey on their stick to a stereotypical pilgrim village, saying they won't learn the language, they're not assimilating, they don't look like us, I say put him back on the Mayflower. Which may or may not be a Wampanoag perspective of today. That perhaps is a slightly different story. I mentioned early on how the Legend and Legacy exhibition had effectively come from us, our idea. It was something that we wanted to do in partnership with them. But what was really interesting and what came out of the partnership was something that they really wanted to do. And that was the exhibition that Ian mentioned earlier, Wampum Stories from the Shelves of Native America. They wanted to create a new wampum belt. Wampum, some of you may know, effectively are shell beads, and they have been and are created into different forms, sometimes jewelry, sometimes pieces of adornment. It's also been used in condolence, in ritual, and in diplomacy. They wanted to create a new wampum belt to honour one that had been lost as a result of the War of 1676, and taken as a spoil of war, brought here and then subsequently lost. That loss is felt very keenly. So they wanted to make a new wampum belt to honour that old one and to do an exhibition which effectively toured the country and enabled people to learn that story. Was it therefore ethically right of us to honour that wish? You know by now what my answer to that was. There has been learning here. My gosh, so much learning really. And this in a way is another L in the ethical, if you like. I mean, we learned a lot given that we opened this exhibition in the middle of a pandemic. So it actually opened last September. You can ask me how, but I'm not quite sure I've got the answer to that fully. It presented ethical issues for us and for our staff, and perhaps beyond that too. Should we have been trying to transport objects across the Atlantic and across Europe in order to stage this exhibition in the middle of a pandemic? It threw up safety issues, security issues in terms of the objects themselves. The picture in the middle is something that we've now done a lot of. It's called virtual couriering. Normally, when an object comes on loan to an exhibition, it comes with a courier, so sometimes the curator, sometimes the conservator, but basically somebody of the institution that holds that collection, and they watch the effective borrowing institution at work and ensure that their object's going to be okay. No couriers could travel, so we did that entirely virtually. So what you have there is our technician filming our conservator. On the other end of the line, if you like, in this case, we had the National Archives, doing a condition check on their object, which we were about to put on display. Again, there are all kinds of ethical issues around that too. And then there's learning, I think, around the fact that ultimately people fascinate people, don't they, really? And that's why I suppose we came up with the Wall of Faces, which is right at the end of that exhibition. 1,053 faces. Some of them historic Mayflower descendants, film stars, presidents, singers, actors, many contemporary descendants of Mayflower passengers who described why they felt this ancestry was important to them. And also on that wall, we have Wampanoag tribal elders who told us why their history and their culture is important to them. Again, you know, have we put up the right people on the wall? The right numbers of people? Does this actually tell a demographic story as well? Have we given enough information about why they're there? Should those who don't have proven lineage be on that wall? Again, more ethical questions. So, where has this voyage taken us ethically? Well, I guess I would say, you would expect me to say, it's taken us on a journey of discovery. And ultimately, we've learned that ships loom large in our imaginations and our histories, and indeed our exhibition. They are literal, they're metaphorical, and they're symbolic. They're about departures, journeys, and arrivals. And always the voyage is never quite what you expect, nor are your fellow passengers, nor indeed is the destination what you thought. So I think perhaps we need to remember that our museological travels have an impact on those we meet and those we share our stories with. We are and have to be ethically responsible at every stage of the trip. But journeys are always memorable, and our Mayflower one certainly will be, in our museum minds at least, and also possibly in the mind of my own therapist. No, I just added that as an extra. That, I hope, gives you a sense of some of the ethical questions, many of them bound up in the history, many of them bound up in the museology, and many in the partnerships and the expectations of today. So as my support group, I'm happy to take any questions you like, and I'll absolutely do my best to answer as honestly and sensibly as I possibly can.
Joe, thank you very much. That was a really, really good question. Sorry, I was thinking about questions. A really, really good and stimulating talk. And I don't know about my colleagues out there in VC land, but I, for one, threw up some really, really important questions for me. So thank you very much indeed. So now, of course, as you've rightly foreshadowed, it's time for questions. There aren't any currently in the chat. Folks, if you want to put questions into the chat function, you're very welcome to do so. Otherwise, I would just invite questions from the virtual floor now. Over to you, folks.
I might jump in quickly at the start, if that's okay. Thank you so much, Joe. That was fascinating. It threw up so many questions and thoughts. I was wondering if you would say a little more about the people from the Wampanoag community who did want to help or did agree to help, and if they expressed why they chose to get involved. Because I thought that was really interesting, the fact that you had that question of would they want to, quite rightly, would they want to get involved? So I wonder if they did express why.
Yeah, that's such a good question. So let me go back in time a little bit and tell you about 1970. I won't mention what happened in Plymouth, UK, because that's a whole other story. But in the States, in Plymouth, Massachusetts, in 1970, at what was the 350th commemoration of this departure and arrival, there was an organising committee. And the organising committee arranged all kinds of events and activities to mark the occasion. They invited a Wampanoag tribal elder to talk at one of the particular events. His name was Wam Sutter, or Frank James, as he, I suppose, is known sort of more popularly. And he wrote a speech and he submitted it to them. And the organising committee said, no, we don't want you to present this. We don't want you to give this speech because it has a lot of elements that we're not very comfortable with. Now, presented with that, you can imagine what Frank James did. And he effectively said, okay, I'm not going to deliver this speech if you are not prepared to hear it in full as part of this commemoration. And he went and delivered his speech in person on an extraordinary site in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And as a result of that speech and him giving it in that way, that effectively led to what has become known as the National Day of Mourning, which is a day where Native Americans mark the impact of colonization, if you like. So fast forward to 2020 and to preparations for 2020, the people of Plymouth, Massachusetts, and the organisers of the 2020 commemoration said, no, we are not going to do this. We are not going to make this mistake. Because, of course, 2020 also marked the 50th anniversary of the National Day of Mourning as well. And so they asked the Wampanoag whether they could work with them. Now, my understanding is that some, I'm going to say key people in the Wampanoag tribal setup came together. And I say they're key people because I think they have been and are quite instrumental and have been over time. So Paula, who is our sort of key advisor, she used to work at what is now Plymouth Patuxent Museums, and she was part of the establishment of the Wampanoag site there. Linda Coombs is heralded as one of the most significant Wampanoag historians. There are 2 federally recognised tribal governments, Mashpee and Aquinnah. So there were representatives from both of those tribal nations within the wider Wampanoag tribal nation, if that makes sense, plus some other people as well. So, for instance, the archivist of the Mashpee tribal government was part of this committee. Why did they want to take part? Indeed. Why did they want to contribute? I think they didn't want the mistakes of 1970 to happen again. I think for them, they are people who have consistently, through their lifetimes, sought to discover and communicate Wampanoag history and culture. So my understanding is what they were doing was consistent with that mission, really. And so they have consistently given their knowledge, expertise, and experience to Plymouth 400 in the States, and then latterly to Mayflower 400 here. I think working here was about finding an international platform and telling the story to ostensibly an English and a wider British population who they feel should know this story, but as they rapidly realised, we don't and didn't. And they told me pretty clearly that they felt that that was irresponsible of us and that they would share their story if we were sincere and genuine about portraying it. So that's very much what the partnership was about. Now, it is fair to say that I think through the Legend and Legacy project, and also even through the Wampum project, there were members of the Wampanoag tribal nations who did not want this association and who felt that it wasn't appropriate. But many of them, I'm sure, felt that, perhaps their ancestors shouldn't have helped the Mayflower arrivals in the first place, and look what that led to. So why help now? And Paula, spoke to me about that. And in a way, what she did with the Wampum project was very much about engagement and engaging that wider community. But, does everyone want to work with us and think it's great? Probably not. All I can say is that those I've spoken to and worked with have done so with the utmost professionalism and generosity. And I think they feel, well, they've said that they feel that this anniversary is so different to 1970, and that actually We have we are wider we, not just we in the museum. We have listened, we have learned, and we have done all that we could to communicate. We couldn't have done that without them. And frankly, I would go so far as to say it would be utterly ridiculous to have even attempted to. It's a great question. It's a very long answer. There's a lot to say on that.
You just have to come back and give us another talk sometime, Joe.
Careful what you wish for.
That's very true. So I just turning to the chat very briefly, and then we'll come back to the floor. There's one person saying thank you very much, really good talk. It's echoed by sentiment is echoed by Malcolm Banger Jones as well, and then Malcolm adds a question, and I'll if it's okay with you, Malcolm, I'll read it out. I'm assuming it is okay. Malcolm says, in Canada, he's been shown various objects which were taken there by immigrants from the Scottish Highlands in the 19th century. Malcolm believes that most, if not all of those, were simply not old enough for that to be the case. I guess what's prompted that question is the Bible you talked about, but he invites you to say a little bit more about the material culture of the Mayflower more generally, and what you have, I suppose, in your exhibition as well from it, if anything.
Yeah, if anything, indeed. Well, we ended up with a lot more than we thought, and had I had my own way, we would have had even more. But Mayflower material culture, you see, I just think that over time this story has become so defining that there is the expectation, certainly in let's say popular circles, that therefore there is masses of material about it. Well, I didn't find that to be the case. Well, I say that. So let's think about this in different kind of parts. If we say Mayflower material culture, meaning what is absolutely specific to the Mayflower as a ship and to the Mayflower passengers themselves, I would say not very much. The truth of it is, we don't know anything about the real ship. Not really. I mean, there may be maritime historians amongst you who are going, what? And I'm not a maritime historian, so I'm really happy to take your view. But my understanding of it is that effectively we have port books, clearly, which note this Mayflower, the Atlantic Mayflower. I think the complication is that during the reign of James I, it seems there were 26 ships called the Mayflower. So always isolating this particular one is a little bit challenging. Of course, while there are some historic records to ship design of this time, particularly Matthew Baker, some of you will know more about this than I do. I think the Matthew Baker records, which I think are in Cambridge. Clearly we have archaeology, but this particular ship, a relatively small cargo ship, which traded in the Mediterranean. The suggestion is perhaps a trip to Norway as well at some point. There's not much about it, really, in terms of design or work. I suppose the most significant item is the last known record of the Mayflower, which is in the National Archives, dates back to 1624. And I asked a colleague to go and find it, and with all due respect to the National Archives, who have been nothing but wonderful to us, it was just in a box with a load of other papers, as perhaps you might expect. We brought that record to Plymouth for the first time, and I think that is significant because it relates to the ship itself and effectively to its demise. It's described as being in a ruinous state. The document was part of a kind of will settlement involving the master's wife. He died by this time, and she effectively was a co-owner. So it gives its value at this period of time. So for me, I think that's a really significant piece. In terms of the passengers themselves, oh my gosh, most of what does exist is in the collections of Pilgrim Hall Museum in Plymouth in Massachusetts. It's the oldest operating public museum in America. It's a great museum with fabulous staff, and again, they couldn't have been more helpful. However, they were marking the anniversary as well. So clearly they didn't want to be loaning all their stuff to us. The Pierce Patent, which I mentioned earlier, which is the document which effectively gave the English passengers English permission to settle in Native America, they loaned that to us. So you could say that relates to that particular ship and those particular passengers. Now, they also have things in their collection like William Bradford, who is very much known as the kind of historian of the group. So they have a couple of his Bibles. They also have, I think, what's rumoured to be Miles Standish's sword. He was the military captain that they hired. What else do they have? Oh, they have a cradle which relates to the baby of one of the families. I can't quite remember which, but you're probably getting the idea of what's there. What I did learn from our Dutch colleagues is that an incredible amount of work has been done on the inventories of the passengers in terms of the books that they read. So very early on, I knew what many of those passengers had in their personal libraries. So I was able to get period versions of those texts rather than the texts themselves. And in a way, I suppose, because the Mayflower material culture is quite limited, I had to, well, some people might say think laterally, other people might say create all manner of tenuous connections. Effectively, what I tried to do was to, if I couldn't get an original Mayflower object, I tried to get the next best thing. So a version, perhaps, of that book in the passenger library. The toys, for instance, are an example of that. But we found all sorts of odd and slightly extraordinary things. So, for instance, half of the group, traditionally known as the Pilgrims or the Separatists, were living in Leiden in the Netherlands before this trip was imagined. And we found a painting of the Burgermeister of Leiden in the collections of Exeter Museum. I still have no idea why the Burgermeister of Leiden is in the collections of Exeter Museum, but he was there. So that helped us to tell a part of the Leiden story. But it's taking, things away, I suppose, in the sense that, the armor, which I mentioned earlier, which I was so keen to use, is that armor the armor that was worn by the passengers of the Mayflower? No, it's not. It's armor of that period, the type that might have been purchasable by those people at that time. So it's off period. It's often of a kind of possible context. But really, I had to keep going kind of one step away in order to keep the context, but try and retain a connection as best I could. I suppose that the second lot of work that we have to think about around the Mayflower story is the story of what I call the story of the story. So it's really about how this history has become all manner of fictional representations in texts texts, in paintings, in films, in songs. And I just think that's part of this. And so we created a section of the exhibition which is loosely a commemorative section, which really, I suppose, looks at some of the cultural legacies of that. So you may well scream, but I became particularly interested in the 1953 Oscar-winning film Plymouth Adventure. Collective groan, perhaps. It starred Spencer Tracy, I'll have you know, and Gene Tierney, and won the Oscar for Best Special Effects. You may go, bit tenuous, Joe, but the fact of it is, that is Hollywood's only representation of the Mayflower story. So I think that's significant. So we brought in some costume designs, original costume designs from that film, from the museums of the Oscars, if you like. Now, I wanted one of Marilyn Monroe's dresses because she happened to be a descendant. I was told that I was going too far. So there are limits on I suppose, those circles of context, if you like. But you can tell. I think Mayflower material culture is really interesting for what it is and what it isn't. I suppose I should say that I was mentored by a colleague of yours in Plymouth, Catherine Gray, who's actually in the English department and specialises in early colonial narratives. So therefore, what we got to, I suppose, was going back to a lot of those original sources and bringing those to us from the British Library for the most part. So that, for instance, was texts like Mort's Relation, which actually I was only able to get in this most recent rotation, thanks to your colleagues in Glasgow. Good News, which is a text that came out of the colony in 1624, that also came to us from Glasgow. So it was a real, I don't know, you could call it a leap of imagination, you could call it curation, you can say, Joe, weren't you hoping for the best? And I'd probably accept a range of all of those.
Thanks very much for that response, Joe. I don't know if Malcolm wants to come back, but kind of connected to that, we've had a really nice comment from our own David Worthington on chat there. I don't know if you want to pick it up at all, David?
Yeah, just briefly if there's time. Thank you, Joe. I really enjoyed that. And I'm a 17th century historian, so besides everything else you said, no.
You're probably horrified, David.
Not at all. I was completely fascinated by it because I'm intrigued always by the possibilities and challenges of curating the 17th century. It seems to be a particular period in which public history, writing about the kind of ways we engage the public of the past, there's just not a huge amount of good stuff. And if you read guidebooks for students about how to write and convey and curate the past, there's almost never anything about this period in any way. So my interest was kind of what you were coming to just a couple of minutes ago about the scholarly influences on you. What you've got you brought a really fascinating conceptual approach to this. Where did that come from? And when are you going to write up the outcomes? Because this is really important stuff.
Oh my gosh, there's so many sort of thoughts in that. Yeah. So, I mean, the reason I laugh and I'm slightly horrified, David, is that as you can tell, I'm not a 17th century historian by a very long stretch. If anything, I'm a modernist. If anything, I'm an oral historian, and I specialize in, I suppose, exhibitions that bring different communities and groups together. Now, as it turned out, those skills were very useful to me. But oh my gosh, was I horrified by the 17th century, because never having spent time in it, at a really basic level, I mean, I found it so difficult in terms of the texts themselves. I found the religious politics, which are effectively pretty central to this particular story, inaccessible. I just found it very, very difficult. And to the extent that actually in some of the early drafts of the text, people said to me, "What's going on with you in this religion section? It's so cold." And I thought, yeah, it's because I'm struggling to connect. And I really had to do some work and give myself a bit of a talking to about that. But I was blessed, I suppose, with Catherine Gray, who I think was my kind of accidental mentor. I read an article of hers which was about really how Massachusetts had told its own history. Effectively, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they'd taken the printing press into America, and they were going to use it. And they did use it. And effectively, they were the literati, they controlled the media of the time, and therefore they controlled the storytelling of the Plymouth colony, you could argue. So I was really influenced by her. So I really just knocked on her door and went, this is interesting, Catherine, tell me more. And she told me more, and then she told me a lot more, and then she told me an awful lot more. And effectively, I think I was trying to juggle a lot of local political agendas. And so I was bringing those to her. And she said very early on, "Jo, whatever we do, we have to create a robust intellectual framework for this. Otherwise, this is going to be, well, as you can imagine." And so I think effectively we started working through what that would look like. And for her and for me, and interestingly enough, this came from English, not ostensibly from history. It was about going back to the original sources and looking at those sources, because those sources, and particularly Mort's relation, 1622, it presents a shared history. There is Edward Winslow, one of the passengers, one of the colonists, describing the Native American politics and that he is now part of, and effectively he gives a sense of the disruption that they're causing and how they are part of the ecology. And if there was one text that was really central to everything we did, it was that. I think influenced by the fact that the Wampanoag people were saying, don't forget, English texts tell you horror stories as well. Horror stories of captivity, of our people being taken from their homelands by English seafarers and sold into slavery in Spain. You need to use those English texts to tell that story, because normally those bits of those texts aren't included. And then, of course, they went on to say, and this was all delivered very sort of orally, they said, well, where are you going to start this story? Because our history starts 12,000 years ago. And our history has only been shared for 400. So where are you going to start? And they said very clearly, and Catherine said very clearly, whatever you do, while this exhibition may mark a 400th anniversary, the fact of the matter is that 1620 is a random date in the continuum of English colonial endeavour, if you like. And so that was absolutely key. It was about the starting point. Also, I was directed to tell a chronological story. So in a way that, while I personally, I think I would have started it backwards. I would have started in 2020 and worked the other way. But that was deemed utter madness. So we started effectively with a pre-contact map of Native America, no English names on it whatsoever. And then effectively we started with a John White, given that those were the images that effectively this side of the Atlantic first saw of that side of the Atlantic. So that was really crucial. So I would say for me to, go back to you with your kind of 17th century perspective, I suppose for me, what fascinated me was a little bit pre your period. So I became slightly obsessed with Roanoke and John White and that earlier lost colony, because I saw that as an early point of connection, probably the earliest proper point of connection. I mean, some of you may know more about Humphrey Gilbert and St. John's, but I took that as, I suppose, the starting point for the shared history. And in terms of text, it was then looking at those early texts that came out of Jamestown, the only surviving text that comes out of the Wampum colony in Maine, which came to us from Lambeth Palace. And then it was about working, because I chose very deliberately to only ever use contemporaneous sources. So as our visitors not just travel through the story, but they travel through time, they do it only with the sources that were available at that time. So when you're in the 1580s, you're seeing John White. When you're in 1608 in Leiden, you're seeing Nicholas Varmond, the Burgomaster of Leiden. And then effectively, when you arrive in Wampanoag, America, we had all kinds of problems because, as you will know, we didn't have 17th century imagery that we could use, not appropriately. There were, of course, there were English maps of early colonial America, but there weren't really paintings, or those that existed came sort of quite a bit later, is my understanding. Again, I'm not an expert on that, but I think, you're looking at least 1680s, 1720s. So we had to really think about, okay, how do we recreate the 1600s in this section visually? And so we got photographs of effectively the historic forests, and we made them look 17th century, if you like. But that was problematic. And within that, I set what I thought, clearly much of the Wampanoag material is there, but also what I suppose I call the subsequent settlement story, which is about those key texts. So it was about Mort's Relation, it was about Good News, it was about William Wood, it was about, I suppose, those early colonists who wrote. And then, of course, we had to include William Bradford's of Plymouth Plantation. Clearly, the original is never going to be leaving America again, given that it spent 200 years here, lost, and there was a fight to reclaim it. So they weren't going to be loaning that to us, certainly not. So in that case, we had to use an 1897 reprint of that text. So yeah, it was tricky, but I have to say it was those original texts, and I suppose what they not just what they told us, but I suppose what they represented as well. And I think working with Catherine from an English perspective meant that there was a slightly different look at those texts as well. I suppose English people look at things just slightly differently. Wry smile from us all, no doubt. So that had a massive influence too.
So thanks very much for that, Joe. I am very conscious that time is passing, and various people have been saying thanks and wishing you well. If though anybody has one last final and short pressing question and a short answer there
Yes, sir.
too, that would be entirely appropriate. So one last chance, folks, for one final last question. You see, whenever you say that,
Yes. What I suppose I should do is just answer the final part of David's question then perhaps, which was about whether an article is coming out about this.
very briefly.
There is a piece on the University of Plymouth website, which is, I think it's called Mayflower Legacies. And there's a whole series of articles there from Catherine herself, and from me and some of the other people looking at Mayflower. So that's probably as close as we've got at the moment. I think you're right in the sense that there's been so much learning and there's, well, as you can tell, so much to say. It really probably does need to be written down in a more concise way.
Indeed. So that's your next task, obviously. Right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attendance this evening, for which was, you know, a really excellent start to our new season. Just a brief reminder that our next talk is on Thursday, the 14th of October, at again at 5:30. This talk is part of the Highland Archaeology Festival, and it's by Professor Elizabeth Ewan, our new visiting professor at the Centre for History. And Professor Ewan is going to be talking about a brewing storm, alewives in 16th century Inverness. So roughly the same time period, roughly, you know, 15th, 16th century. I don't understand these things, but a rather different topic. Hope to see folks there for that. In the meantime, thank you very much for your attendance, but above all, thank you very much to Joe for a really fascinating talk. Thank you. And cheery ho to everybody who remains with us. Bye bye now.
Thanks so much. Bye all.